Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Across the Dinerverse, searching for the heart and soul of America, one diner at a time. How you doing? I'm John Murphy. I'm a writer and producer on the science and technology series Innovation Nation, which airs Saturday mornings on CBS. Check your local listings for air times. But now I make my way across the country talking to people over omelet burritos, pigs in a blanket, and old school liver and onions. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I can't do it. I just can't do liver and onions. Or the tongue thing. I mean, to eat the tongue, I can't do it. Anyway, I travel around the country and I talk to people about their lives, their hometowns, and how they feel about the good old USA. I mean, do we need a national intervention, a revolution, or just a good long vacation somewhere else? As you may know by now, my goal is to do a podcast from at least one diner in all 50 states. So if you'd like to pitch in and help me get there, please visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/Dinerverse and become a patron for as little as $3, which means you can throw out questions to ask on future podcasts, get exclusive behind-the-scenes photos and content, or use me as a witness to sign off on legal documents. Yeah, happy to do that for you. So, how did I come up with this week's episode? Well, it's a bit of a story. I've been working for months on a true crime series of podcasts from a diner back in my home state of Nebraska near my hometown of McCook. It's actually called the Anvil Bar and Grill in Curtis, Nebraska. And this true crime happened exactly 50 years ago this year. A farm couple in their 50s went missing for about 10 days back in September of 1973. 10 days later, their body parts started floating in a nearby reservoir. And that just unleashed this whole mystery that was twisty and crazy and sex, and it's bizarre. Their daughter was involved, but she wasn't the killer. The relationship that the daughter had with another couple is the interesting angle to the whole thing. And this happened back way before forensic science was available to kind of unearth what was really going on. And I actually have the taped confession of the killer and the people involved with the case, including the lead investigator. And I wanted to include a forensic psychologist to give me some insight into the mindset of the people involved in this actual case like 50 years ago. And even by today's standards, it's kind of shocking. And it took me some time to find one who would come on the show because, they're busy, or they didn't want to comment on the case because they weren't familiar with it, or they simply ignored my calls, texts, and emails. But I finally found one, and he's actually from Nebraska. Dr. Mario Scalora, PhD, a licensed clinical psychologist, a professor of psychology at the University of Nebraska, as well as a forensic specialist. And he's also the director of the University of Nebraska's Public Policy Center in Lincoln. So I flew back to Nebraska to talk about the case, and then our conversation drifted to kind of the mental health of America right now, post-COVID. It feels like we're off. I don't know if you feel it or not, but yeah, it kind of feels like the nation is off. People are angrier, less accommodating and friendly. Social media is a shit show right now where everything and everyone is attacked or ridiculed. Violent crime is up. Then we have the mass shootings, hundreds of them. And so I wanted to get Dr. Scalora's take on where we are mental health-wise as a country. So I didn't have a lot of time to prep for this. It was kind of bad and stealthy. And I recorded our talk privately at a diner called the Highway Diner in Lincoln at 2105 Nebraska Parkway on the south side of town. It's been there for over 30 years. They have a great motto, which is, don't ask, just believe. So I didn't ask permission, and I just believed I wouldn't get caught. So I went in there and recorded this conversation with Dr. Mario Scalora. The Highway Diner, by the way, is known for their 5-egg omelets, magic toast, and something called the Hot Stripper, which I will tell you about at the end of this podcast. So let's get into it. America, are we going batshit crazy, having a national mental breakdown, or just going through a rough patch? Here's Dr. Scalora.
You know, it's an up and down phenomenon. I think I wouldn't be doing work in violence prevention if I didn't think we had reasons to be optimistic about certain things. We have had some interesting things happen over the last several years that have been one in a century kind of events.
So COVID
certainly has been a hell of a curveball.
For the world.
For the world, and it impacted large parts of everyone's lives, and still does, right? I mean, just even think about very practical issues, supply chain. Your family wants to buy a car or a refrigerator. It wasn't what it was 5 years ago.
Right.
We're having to approach the world a little differently right now. We've had to renegotiate what it meant to have, not that we ever had, work-life balance. We always worked very hard, right? And as Americans, we tend to work harder than other folks. We're also very materialistic and enjoy the benefits of those things.
Yes.
And we, as a nation, have had a major disruption of how we even relate to each other, how we communicate at work has changed, what our expectations are of work. Some of those things are good. Some of them are not so good.
I would also point out that even prior to COVID, there was huge political upheaval during the Trump administration and what it did politically to our country, and seemed to divide us even more.
We've been a very politically divided country for a long time, and it came to a head several years ago. We're almost two countries. I don't know about you, and people might not notice looking at me, but I try to work out every morning. And and if you work out at places, you see TVs up there, right? And so you're on your elliptical machine or your treadmill, and on one TV, you'll see CNN. On another, you'll see MSNBC, on another Fox News. And you'll be darned if you know what country you're in, because you're seeing in the same country 3 news feeds.
They're different.
That focus on 3 different things.
Yeah.
And if I'm predisposed to leaning one way, I'm watching one station, and I'm getting all my news from those kind of feeds. And I don't find things that counteract my worldview anymore. And by the way, I see the bad part of this on either side of the political divide, because I spent 30 years of my life looking at political threat and you see bad stuff on both sides.
Right.
That doesn't mean when bad things are happening, it's always equivalent. There are certain groups that push things, and more recent history, certain people need to be held accountable for that poison. We were very polarized to begin with. We then have these things that are crappy phones, but great cameras and great texting devices that allow me or you to go online and download feeds. So just like when we're doing these things,
like this podcast,
I'm going to get news alerts about things that they think are of interest to me. When there's a school shooting somewhere, because I do work in school threat assessment, that pops up on my phone, and I'm pinging my colleagues who do this work. Hey, heads up, there was a shooting in Kentucky or Iowa or wherever.
Or Michigan State. I mean, Nebraska is a Big Ten school.
And I know colleagues at Michigan State, and my heart ached when I saw that. And also knew they were going through hell and very busy. Last thing I needed to do was bothering them when they're managing, but afterwards saying, hey, if you need something. And you recognize there, but by the grace of God can go I. So you see that. We can get video feeds of almost anything. And people who do these things are getting more attention for their acts. And they know that if they wanted to raise hell, they're going to become famous or infamous as a result.
Is that really a motivating reason for some of these people to do this?
Oh, hell yes, unfortunately. So there's a gentleman who I respect a lot who talked about the role of how the press should cover this, Mark Folman, with Mother Jones, who talked about, we can't give these people
all the attention,
the stage.
Right.
We should talk about what happened. We should explore why it happened, but let's not mention their names and let's not have their pictures all over the place. Now, when Michigan State happened, as an example, they needed to find the guy who did it. So putting his picture up there made total sense so they could find him and get him.
Because he was still at large.
Absolutely.
And still a huge threat.
There was a public safety interest, and amen, they handled that extremely well, in my opinion. But on the other hand, you have 5 people dead. The last thing you want to do is keep talking about them and their social media feed and how they're getting all this attention. And, you know.
Yeah.
And so there's this balancing act. We need to have transparency, need to know what happened, but we also don't want to give glory to the mouth breathers who did it.
You have a divided country politically. You have the impact of COVID and the mental, emotional disruption that it had on individuals and families. A lot of people isolated. Most people do not do well in isolation and lockdown.
Right.
I think we're seeing the results of that. Would you agree?
And more people are more attuned to their mental health, which at one level is great.
Yes.
But it also means now they're recognizing their mental health isn't good right now or hasn't been good, and they're trying to sort it out.
And then you have on top of that now going out in a flame of glory. If somebody has some anger issues, and you wrote a paper about all these mass shootings can't be attributed to mental illness.
Right.
You wrote, and I found it very, very interesting in statistics. Most of these mass shootings or any kind of gun violent crime or weapons oriented violent crime does not involve somebody with a mental illness.
Right. No, you read that well, and read it right. And we've known that, but I think there are 2 things that happen. One, it's hard for us to want to believe that a rational person can just cause harm to that many people. It doesn't make sense to our values, our rationality, and it's got to be crazy. The other piece is this has become a political issue. It's become a gun issue. It's become a mental health issue. And we can't have middle-of-the-road conversations about it because if you bring up one or the other, it's precluding something else.
So you have to pick a side.
You have to pick a side. And by the way, we become a pick-a-side society. And by the way, add on top of all the things you mentioned, we had George Floyd.
Right.
You had the murder of that man.
Yeah. The cops in Memphis, black cops killing a black individual.
You had a man who was executed in plain sight, in front of multiple cops, by multiple cops.
Recorded on their own body cams.
I'm livid. I work with police a lot. I work with a lot of men and women who are very devoted public servants who get tarnished by the residue of this horrible behavior. And when you see this, you have communities who already have challenging relationships with police going, what the hell? Why should we trust them? And you had what some called an uprising after George Floyd, where you saw for the first time in almost 50 years, violence in the streets over political issues. As a result, now we're trying to talk about how do we prevent violence in our community. And a big part of that is police. And typically, like when we talk about mass shootings or a school shooting or something, we know these people put warning signs in advance. One of the things we want people to do is tell someone in authority, tell someone at the school, tell police, tell somebody. Well, if you're not trusting authority, or if there is a narrative out there that law enforcement can't be trusted, or that there is a fracture in a relationship between a community and its police and its public safety, how do we prevent crime? All those things coming together have been very challenging. And as a result, I think when we had a point where violent crime was actually going down for a while and had gone down for quite a bit.
All right, so here are some quick facts from the website Statista.com. In 2021, there were 22,900 reported cases of murder or non-negligent manslaughter in the U.S., and that figure has decreased since 1991, when there were 24,700 murder and non-negligent manslaughter cases. However, this is an increase from the previous year, when 22,000 cases of murder were reported. The lowest violent crime rate since the turn of the century was back in 2014, when there was only 14,319 murders. And I say that It just sounds weird. Only. I mean, 14,000 people lost their lives, but that's a lot less than nearly 23,000 people today. And by the way, since 2009, there have been over 300 mass shootings in the U.S., with California and Texas tied with 33 mass shooting events each.
There are some aspects of crime that went up, right? We see domestic violence and relational crime when COVID hit. Those things were very troubling. But other crimes went down. And there was a period of time pre-COVID when we were having a lot of success knocking down the crime rate.
And why do you think that was working? What was working at the time?
I think you had a range of things, from good economic situation. You had law enforcement in a lot of places doing community policing and relationships. You had a lot
building trusts with the community.
You had police departments doing, and community groups all working together. And then
they weren't.
Things unraveled. And so now we're seeing this horrible spate, by the way, which had been going for an extended period. We've seen some of this happening over a period of time. This isn't just the last couple of years, but it has more increased lately, and it's getting more attention where we see these mass violence, mass attacks. So it also raises a specter. What about other violent crime, things like that? And you could have these things going on, but otherwise some crimes decreasing. But the perception is what drives people's view of reality.
As a forensic psychologist, and I know you don't work with the Memphis Police Department, or do you?
No.
Okay, so you don't work with the Memphis Police Department. What was the possible psychology of these black police officers doing what they did to that man, another black man, in their community? And it wasn't one rogue cop, it was like 5 of them, all contributing to his death.
Yeah, that's a great question.
What was going on in their heads?
And I work with some police agencies, so I got to be careful how I answer that, because I also know that making public statements about that as a psychologist who consults with agencies can come up in other ways. So I'm walking that line. But the questions that jump to my head right away are twofold. One, what's the culture of that agency where people thought they could do shit like that and get away with it? You mentioned that they were wearing body cameras and had to be aware that there are cameras on street lamps and places overhead. One of the best things about body cams was that it had highlighted transparency on both sides. Because if somebody complained they were mistreated by the police, you looked at the footage.
Right.
Some cases, the footage didn't support the allegation. In other cases, it was like, what the heck? What were they thinking? So one is, what's the culture where people are going to do that? I know there's an investigation going on. I wonder what all the motives were going on. I think there's something else going on
that we don't know yet.
I wonder if there's something we don't know. That's one thing. And I'm not trying to be conspiracy theory. This is how investigations go. There's crap they don't put out there because it's an investigation. And the race part on the cops, I understand why people are focusing on that, because you look at prior violence, it wasn't black cops involved. What is it about the police culture that made it so that they could view this one citizen as dispensable? And the stats that people raise are black citizens viewed as more dispensable than white citizens. You can appreciate why people in the minority community raise that question. Is there something about police culture that's reinforcing that? And so that's an open question you got to sort out. And I know a lot of cops where that would be an anathema to them and would not practice that way. But what the hell was going on there? 1. 2, should they have been cops?
Let's be honest. 10 to 12% of the people in any profession are jerks.
Right.
You can be, and that includes the church. Right. That includes government. That includes schools, teachers, industry, business, Wall Street, medical profession. 10% of the people are just assholes.
And that's true, but we don't want 10% of our pilots doing that.
No.
Because if they make a mistake, somebody dies. My surgeon could be a jerk, but I want my surgeon not to be that 10%. when we give somebody a badge and a gun and we indemnify them, and by the way, we put them in difficult spots.
Yeah.
Because no matter when they show up, and I think some of the commentary about police reform has been overly simplistic. When a cop shows up, cops aren't going out of their way to create business. Half the folks aren't happy they are there. So you're going to have somebody upset at you.
Don't cops have to take a psychological test evaluation before they give them the badge and the gun?
Absolutely. And so I can't speak to those specific people in Memphis. But anytime something goes on like that, one is the culture. What was the accountability? Two, were these people actually properly screened and vetted to engage in that kind of behavior? It's one thing if somebody's in a conflict. Let's say I'm trying to restrain you and you get upset and you get wound up and then I get pissed off because you popped me in the nose. You might expect that there are going to be times when somebody gets upset in response to that. It still may be sanctioned, but it's still contained versus abject brutality from the beginning. You have to ask, what was it that didn't get screened out? This is challenging now because law enforcement agencies are very short. They're very short-staffed.
People are not signing up to be new police officers.
Right, they're not.
Given the last 2 or 3 years in the streets.
And it's challenging. And by the way, we don't want everybody to sign on. And
you want the best.
You want people who meet criteria who can handle that job.
When you talk about the mindset of somebody who wants to harm a large group of people, you mentioned, the fame or the infamy of it going out in a blaze of glory. What do you think are the things that lead up to that? Because there's been so many. Are so many of these just literally copycats?
There is a copycat phenomenon, but people just don't do it out of the blue. There seems to be some common themes that have happened over the last few decades as we look at this. First of all, they all leave breadcrumbs. They're all warning signs in advance. Very rarely in any of these shootings aren't there warning signs that we don't pick up on after the fact, unfortunately. What could have been picked up on early or were picked up on, but somebody didn't report it.
Because they didn't want to be that bad guy.
They didn't want to be the snitch, or they didn't want to. They were worried they couldn't do it discreetly. See something, say something means a lot. We need to reinforce two things. One, see something, say something now, and you can do it discreetly. We can get people help. 99.99 out of 10,000, we're going to get people help. They're not going to get thrown in jail. They're not going to be the next mass shooter when you're seeing something of concern. People don't kill over policy. People do things like this. They do serious violence over personal grievances. The grievance may not always be rational in the mind of the rest of us, but in their mind, it's justified. And so you have someone with multiple layers of motivations. Somehow they've been tied into something. There's harm. There's something like that. They feel they've been mistreated.
Or even not even heard.
But it's serious enough where they feel like it's been damaging to them.
Do you think isolation of COVID and coming out of that could be a factor in that?
The dynamics are the same. Did it add kerosene to the fire? Probably. Then you have something that they tie it to. And we're seeing a different layering of grievances now, where their delusions are saying they're at risk or they're being messed with. Or you could have more extremist doctrine getting thrown out there. You don't have to join an extremist group to be inspired by them to do things. So you have somebody going into a supermarket in Buffalo who may have been espousing neo-Nazi or racist things that you could pick up from a neo-Nazi website. Now, was he part of a group? Doubtful. Don't know. I'm not speaking specifically, just an example. But you can read their garbage online and be inspired by them. And we're seeing more and more of that. You don't have to be ideologically pure. You could have different types of hate groups putting out garbage, inspiring you to do things to help your personal grievance and also explaining how to do it.
Does that reveal a mental or emotional flaw in somebody? Or is it this? They don't feel a part of anything. They want to be a part of something, and they're willing to die to be a part of something, some ideology, some reasoning, some rationale, some group. They just want to be a part
That's a brilliant question. I'm less inclined to see these folks as they may have had emotional stress, a lot going on, but not this characterological flaw. Because you see a wide range of people doing these acts. You know, it'd be easier if we could find the profile of the messed up personality who does this. That just ain't there. What we're finding is that those folks are willing to go down for their personal grievance or cause. They may get the notoriety from it, or they may be at the point of, I don't care anymore, I'm ready to go down, and willing to let the world know. And in some cases, willing to do it in a splash so that the world sees their grievance. Because many of these folks are going out of the way to put the videos of themselves out there, explaining their grievance in advance. Some ways, not that differently than what terrorists did before they did suicide bombings. You know, they started parroting what happened overseas in terms of what other groups did. You know, in Roanoke, Virginia.
You mean like ISIS and things like that?
Right. You know, when you think about IED attacks and things, they videoed them, right?
Right.
Because they could raise money. They brought attention to them. You had the Roanoke shooter who killed the reporter and the cameraman during a live feed. He videotaped himself doing it at the time and was uploading it after the fact. You have these shooters, the nightclub shooting in Orlando, doing these kinds of uploads and things. And, you know, part of that increases the fear factor. Part of it is highlighting, let me show you what I can do.
How bad I am.
How badass I can be, how I can increase fear and show you're not protected. Or here's my grievance and why. The New Zealand shooter, I notice I don't mention any of these SOBs by name.
Right.
We're not giving them any fame. The New Zealand shooter, who's viewed as a saint by a lot of these mass shooters, he videoed himself doing it and bragged about and had a manifesto laying all this out. And people are quoting his manifesto at times. When
other shooters are quoting this New Zealand shooter's manifesto.
This is part of the legacy.
That goes back to my point. Are they trying to be part of a group of mass shooters now?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's a hell of a club, isn't it? That may be part of that, or it could just be, let me show you how I transcend. The attack in itself is transcending, gives meaning to what I'm doing. Either because I'm like these other people or because I can go out the way I want to in a blaze.
Why are most of the mass shooters white? Some have been Asian. Some have mostly been just white, Anglo-Saxon, European kind of descent. There's been no Hispanics. There's been no Black Americans doing this. And are we the only country that is experiencing this? Because I don't see news feeds of it happening in Sweden and Germany. If it does, it's isolated. It's not like week to week to week to week.
We've certainly been cornering the market on it here, but it's been happening elsewhere. It has crossed gender, racial lines, but not as much. It's not as dramatic. You know, the interesting thing is this isn't your typical young person violent crime. You have a lot of older folks.
Right.
Who are doing this, including folks who are technically elderly. Why? I don't know. These are being driven by a different array of grievances. I hope someday we have a better understanding. I don't have a good answer.
How do you go about understanding that from a psychological perspective? How do you analyze the data and the statistics and come up with a compelling thesis as to the why of it all?
I think you constantly have to look at the behavior of these actors, and you have to look at the content of their work, their communications, their behavior, to see the underlying layers of their grievance.
Let me ask you a question. So you here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, say there was an active shooting, a mass shooting on this UNL campus. God forbid it ever happens.
Right.
But say if there was. You're called to be part of the case. The mass shooter is apprehended. What is your strategy? What is your angle of attack to get into the why and the causes and conditions of this mass shooting? What would be your approach?
You know, I think just like what the FBI would do in a case like this, first of all, you're going to look at all the other stuff going on. This person just didn't show up out of the blue. What are they putting out there? Online, social media? What did they tell family and friends? Why did they show up at the campus? Rarely are those just random events. Why is this person so pissed at that campus? A lot of these cases, they're more than willing to talk if they stay alive, if they don't take themselves out either as a suicide by cop or by their own hand.
They want their story out there.
They want their story out there, but they're going to die on their own terms.
And what kind of questions would you ask them?
Well, part of it is what happened, why this campus, why now, what's going on. Sometimes they're going to be very straightforward, sometimes not. You're going to get as much information from the external and collateral info than you would the interview.
You wrote a paper, or co-authored a paper called Guns Don't Kill People, Crazy People Kill People, where you kind of attack that phrase, and you say that's really not crazy people who are doing most of the mass shootings. So are guns part of the problem? And if so, what kind of solution or practical ways can we regulate them? There's so many millions of unregulated, unaccounted for guns in America. You can still pretty much get them anywhere, can't you?
It's pretty easy to get access to weapons. I think the gun issue is first of all, it's very contentious, right? And someone who's middle of the road like me gets frustrated we can't have, and I appreciate this opportunity where we can have a sane conversation. I think the gun thing gets played almost too simplistically. There are a lot of guns out there, and so when I do risk assessments, if I think somebody shouldn't have access to them because of chaotic mental health presentation or their desire to want to hurt people, one, what are the legal leverages to do that? Two, even if they surrender their weapons, how easily can they access? I have to assume someone can access weapons, even if they don't, quote, own a gun. That's just the reality. There are over 300 million guns out there.
That many?
I think there's a large number.
300 million guns.
It's some outstanding number like that. The other problem we run into with guns is that we have these regulations, but we don't enforce them very well because we have too many holes in how information moves around. Let's say let's just take the notion of the person who's the felon who shouldn't have access. How do those checks get done? Does that info get fed into the system properly? There are gaps with that. When we talk about mental illness and guns, I'll ask people, how many of you know someone who's either on medication for mental health issues, even not necessarily anything from depression, anxiety, whatever? 2/3, 3/4 of the room's going to raise their hand. Now, many of those folks are individuals who are getting treated for taking a pill for depression, anxiety, maybe helping with something like PTSD. Bipolar, the range of things, right? And are doing it and are managing the mental illness like 90% of the people who suffer from mental illness do. And they're not a risk to anyone, whether they have a gun or not. When we look at the broad array of people who have mental illness, just calling it mental illness ain't enough. And by the way, we have folks like veterans, many of whom have had to deal with issues like PTSD, and we've had to destigmatize this because, God bless them, we put them in harm's way more times than we should have. But if they come out with PTSD, we want them to get help. We don't reward that with saying, oh my God, you have PTSD. By the way, you're trained, you've managed your weapons responsibly, and your mental illness isn't really making you more dangerous, but because you have this illness, you can't have a weapon anymore.
We're taking it away.
We can't do that. It doesn't make sense. It would be a galactically stupid policy. There's a small portion of folks with mental illness who even end up hospitalized.
Voluntarily or involuntarily?
Yeah, either, let's say. Then there is this band of people who are a very distinct and small minority of folks who have serious mental illness, they're treatment resistant, and as a result, they're going to cause they're a potential risk. Those folks may end up more likely to get an involuntary hospitalization because of safety risk to themselves or to someone else. They've had to be adjudicated by someone to be at risk to even be put in that facility against their will. Objectively, that is a higher risk group. I have no way of knowing who those folks are if they want to buy a gun. We can't flag those people.
You can't send their private information into a national database.
Right, as we shouldn't.
Because they have privacy rights about their health.
And their privacy rights are as strong as yours and mine. But can we find a way to create a flagging system, just like there's some folks who can't travel, who are in the do not fly thing, right? And we find ways to manage that. You don't know why they're on the no-fly list.
They know, the no-fly list people know, but nobody else needs to know.
And how can we create a flagging system for that so that we're protecting the dignity of people's privacy But if they, and by the way, have due process to argue, I'm no longer that risky person, get me off the list. If the gun range where I go to wants to responsibly restrict people who are high risk from getting weapons, we got to feed them the information. How do we restrict people who are having some serious crises in their lives? We can do this in a way that doesn't restrict everybody else.
There's absolutely no way we can pinpoint who's going to crack next, can we?
Well, the folks who are doing those shootings you were raising about were putting out breadcrumbs in advance and warning signs. Most of those ugly situations weren't people snapping.
I think in the last 5 years, we've had like over 300 mass shootings.
Right.
Over 300. How many of those would be in the mental illness category, do you think?
That's a great question. It depends what database you look at. Still is not the majority of cases. Let's say I'm worried about you because you start spouting off some things that are very concerning. Are there legitimate grounds when we should restrict certain people? The Second Amendment folks would say, hey, this could be abused. This is something that has to be done very carefully, and people should have the right to due process. You can't just have someone go, oh, John said some scary things to me, take his guns. Agreed.
Yep.
On the other hand, there are some circumstances where people may cross some serious lines. At what point can we say, what are restrictions that should be placed on this person's behavior when they cross certain lines? When they're threatening, when they're engaging in intimidation, when they're threatening people's lives, things like that.
That sounds all good in theory. But
Right.
in practicality, sometimes those grievances that build and erupt into wanting to act out violently in a mass way, where you're harming a large group of people, like the shooter in Las Vegas, even if he was planning it in
Right.
advance, and as you say, these breadcrumbs, how can the bureaucracy of a system start collecting this information so we can start alerting the right people that this is a problem? We should maybe go in.
We're doing that in communities. You know,
It is starting to happen.
We're doing that. We're
Okay.
doing threat assessment teams. Homeland Security is working more with locales.
How quickly can you build a profile on someone?
Well, you don't have to build a profile. And that's the thing. You keep it behavioral. When people cross a threshold and they raise red flags is when we should do something. And that's when...
Not making a judgment about their mental assessment, just a
Right.
behavioral assessment.
Yes. It's got to be behavioral. This is the promise of community policing. This is the promise of threat assessment teams. It's the promise of bringing people together and recognizing that if somebody comes to me and says, hey, our friend John here has made some really concerning statements, I start with the assumption that maybe John needs help versus John is the next mass shooter. I'm more likely to get you help, and we're going to de-escalate and get you on an off-ramp.
Do you see us getting out of this cycle of violence?
I wouldn't be wasting my time trying to work in prevention if I didn't think we could.
Well, thank you for that. I really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dr. Scalora, thank you so very much. Nice meeting you. Thank you for being on these podcasts with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that wraps up another episode of Across the Dinerverse. A huge thank you to the Highway Diner in Lincoln, Nebraska. And like their motto says, don't ask, just believe. I didn't ask, and nobody got hurt. Learn more about them at highwaydinerlincoln.com. That's all one word, Highway. By the way, that's H-I, not with no G-H, H-I-W-A-Y, highwaydinerlincoln.com. And try their famous hot stripper sandwich. You want to know what it is? Okay, here it is. 3 chicken strips with sausage gravy on a soft bun. Theme music by Keith Brock and the Kings Who Rock. Everything you want to know is at Keith Brock and the KingsWhoRock.com. Across the Dinerverse, searching for the heart and soul of America, one diner at a time. I'm John Murphy. What's your story?